But now here's the real, the rest. So that was a facial muscle. Now we're heading into the muscles of the neck. So, superficial muscles of the neck. Again, the platysma, what we just read. Origin, that originates skin over lower neck and upper lateral thorax. Inserts at the mandible, the inferior border, and the skin over lower face and angle of the mouth. It innervates with the facial nerve, which again is cranial nerve 7. The action is that it depresses and wrinkles skin of lower face and mouth, tenses skin of neck, aids in forced depression of the mandible. Alright, then the sternocleidomastoid. So the sternal head originates at the sternum and also the manubrium. It inserts at the temporal bone, the mastoid process, the occipital bone, the superior nuchal line. Innervation is caused, so the motor innervation is the accessory nerve, which is cranial nerve 11, and the pain and proprioception is caused by the cervical plexus coming from C2 and C3. And the actions unilaterally, it tilts the head to the same side and rotates to the opposite side. And bilaterally, it extends the head and aids in respiration when the head is fixed. Next is the clavicular head, which originates at the clavicle, the medial 1/3, inserts at the temporal bone, the mastoid process, and the occipital bone, the superior nuchal line. Innervation, the motor is done by the accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, and the pain and proprioception is the cervical plexus coming from C2 and C3. The actions unilaterally, it tilts the head to the same side and rotates to the opposite side. Bilaterally, it extends the head and aids in respiration when the head is fixed. Then we have the trapezius, the descending part, originates at the occipital bone and the spinous processes of C1 through C7. Inserts at the clavicle, lateral 1/3. Innervation, the motor is done by the accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, and the pain and proprioception is done by the cranial plexus C2 and C3. Action unilaterally, it draws the scapula obliquely upward and rotates the glenoid cavity inferiorly. Let's take a sippy break. Quick little sip. Okay. We're doing great. Alright, so we have the suprahyoid muscles. So starting with the digastric. The anterior belly originates at the mandible, the digastric fossa. It inserts at the hyoid bone, the body, via the intermediate tendon with a fibrous loop. It is innervated by the mylohyoid nerve from cranial nerve V3. I'm not sure if V3 means 8 or if V3 means V3. I don't really know whatever. It's from CNV3, cranial nerve V3. I don't know what that means. The action is that it elevates the hyoid bone during swallowing and assists in opening the mandible. And then the posterior belly originates at the temporal bone, the mastoid notch in the medial to the mastoid process. Inserts at the hyoid bone, body, via the intermediate tendon with a fibrous loop. Innervates the facial nerve coming from cranial nerve 7. And the action is that it elevates the hyoid bone during swallowing and assists in opening the mandible. Then we have the stylohyoid, which originates at the temporal bone, the styloid process. Inserts at the hyoid bone, body, via a split tendon. Doesn't that make sense? The styloid and the hyoid. Stylohyoid, anybody? Innervation is done by the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7. And the action is that it elevates the hyoid bone during swallowing and assists in opening the mandible. Then we have the mylohyoid. It originates at the mandible, the mylohyoid line. Inserts at the hyoid bone, the body, via the median tendon of insertion, the myloraph. Innervation is done by the mylohyoid nerve from CNV3. And the action is that it tightens and elevates the oral floor, draws hyoid bone forward, swallowing, assists in opening mandible and moving it side to side, mastication. And we have the geniohyoid, which originates at the mandible, the inferior mental spine, inserts at the hyoid bone, the body, innervates from the anterior ramus of C1 via cranial nerve 12. And the action is that it draws the hyoid bone forward for swallowing and assists in opening the mandible. Then we have infrahyoid muscles. Starting with the omohyoid. The origin is the scapula, the superior body, and it inserts at the hyoid bone at the body. Innervation is done by the ansa cervicalis and cervical plexus from C1 to C3. And the action is that it depresses, fixes the hyoid, draws larynx and hyoid down for phonation and terminal phases of swallowing. And you have the sternohyoid. The origin is the manubrium and sternoclavicular joint, the posterior surface. It inserts on the hyoid bone, the body. Innervation is done by the ansa cervicalis and of cervical plexus from C1 to C3. And the action is that it depresses, fixes the hyoid, draws larynx and hyoid down for phonation and terminal phases of swallowing. Then you have the sternothyroid. The origin is the manubrium, the posterior surface. Inserts at the thyroid cartilage, the oblique line. Innervation is done by the ansa cervicalis of cervical plexus, C2 to C3. And the action is that it depresses the hyoid, draws larynx and hyoid down for phonation and terminal phases of swallowing. Then you have the thyrohyoid. The origin is the thyroid cartilage, the oblique line. Insertion is the hyoid bone, the body. Remember again, thyroid hyoid, thyrohyoid. Innervation is done by C1 via the hypoglossal nerve, which is at cranial nerve 12. And then the action is that it depresses and fixes the hyoid, raises the larynx during swallowing.